The Flyover Libertarian, Episode 4.
Hey, what's up? This is the Flyover Libertarian Podcast, where two unimportant people from an unimportant place give you the opinion that you didn't ask for. I'm Josh, aka Iowancap.
And I'm the Rural Rothbard. Today we're talking about anarcho-capitalism, libertarianism, and how it relates to conservatism.
This is a subject that we'll periodically get questions about or comments about on the page, where when we're talking about, it'll happen in one of two ways. Either we'll be talking about something and talking about hating the state and things like that, and somebody will make the comment, wait a minute, I thought you were libertarians, not anarchists. Or it'll go the other direction, where we're making some comment about libertarianism, and they'll say, so that's why you don't be a libertarian and be an anarchist instead. I think that comes from a little bit of confusion about, first of all, whether or not you can be both, and also what libertarianism is, I guess, for lack of a better phrase.
So would you say anarcho-capitalism is a subset of libertarianism?
Yeah. The way I would understand is like this. Libertarianism, and I explain this pretty often, so maybe if you're a frequenter of our page, you've seen this before. But before libertarianism is anything, it is actually a moral view. It's a moral view about what is justified aggression, whether or not you can own property, and whether or not you can use violence in various situations. And largely libertarianism says, well, we are what's called, private property absolutists. We believe that private property is, all rights are based on property rights, is how many libertarians will say it. That you have a right to self-ownership, to ownership of what is yours, either by mixing your labor with unclaimed land or unclaimed things, or through purchase, through voluntary exchange of goods. And no one has the right to commit aggressive violence against someone, person, or property. And then from there it becomes a legal theory that we would say that this is the basis of legality. This is why we say all rights are property rights. Whoever owns the property has the right to say what goes on it, and any violence committed against a person's body or property is illegal. And that's the definition of what is illegal. And that's really all libertarianism is a statement about property rights and violence, and specifically aggressive violence. Sometimes people say it's about don't hurt people, don't take their stuff, which is, I think, close. But it's more don't hurt someone unless they've threatened to hurt you or have hurt you. If it's in response to aggression, then violence is permissible. Libertarianism isn't necessarily pacifism, though I know many, Robert Murphy, would be both pacifists and libertarians. They aren't necessarily the same thing. And I think the confusion comes from the fact that when most people think of libertarianism, they think of, minarchism. That's what they think it is. They think it's equivalent with minarchism or some sort of extreme constitutionalism, or just, small government, high freedom is a lot of the things that we'll hear said. And that's not necessarily wrong. I think minarchists are libertarians, but I also think that anarchists are libertarians. If you're an anarchist on the basis of property rights and the non-aggression principle. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and have you seen, that was actually a discussion that came up in the Reformed Libertarianism Facebook group, where CJ Engel was talking about the basis of libertarianism being either property rights or the non-aggression principle. Did you see that discussion?
No, I don't think I did.
And so you're arguing that it has to be property rights
Yes,
first,
I would take
primarily.
that side. Yeah, and I think that's where
I think that's what
yeah,
C.J. Engel
and I
said.
think that's
Yeah.
where like Stefan Kinsella, I think Rothbard would also land there. That really what we're doing is we're starting with the fact that a person has a right to their own body and to their own property, and then aggression is because they have a right. Aggression is not allowed because they have a right to their body and their property, and aggression is a violation of that right.
Yeah, yeah. So the non-aggression principle comes
Yeah,
out of um,
like
property
it's
rights.
still like
Gotta
yeah,
have a
it's still
base
very
there.
central to libertarianism, but I think it's important that we don't get the cart before the horse. Like aggression is aggression because you're violating my property rights, not because you're telling me something, you know, that I don't want to hear, or you're telling me not to do something that I really want to do. That's not aggression. Uh, I mean, very specifically. Okay, let's get real weird here. Let's say you want to walk into my house
Oh
and
boy.
put pornography on my TV. It's not aggression for me to make you turn it off, and even if necessary, to use force to make you turn it off because it's my house, and I don't want my kids watching that. And then if you're like, well, that's not very libertarian of you. No, that's incredibly libertarian of me. That is as libertarian as I can be. It's my property. I can do what I want there.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. Because it's private property. That that reminds me of a similar thing where I'm a pretty big fan of
uh-huh.
nonprofits and cooperatives, and I think that those are actually very libertarian and very free market because they're a private use of the means
Right.
of production that are they're just working out their ends through different means but within
Absolutely.
the same system of private
Yeah.
property. So I think those are two different ways to think about the point isn't um you can do whatever you want, and the point isn't you should seek profit always, some kind of messed up Ayn
Yeah.
Rand thing. It's just like private property rights because you own yourself and you own your
Yeah. In
stuff.
fact, libertarianism really like and this is where I always like say libertarianism per se really doesn't have anything to say about things like making a profit, about making money.
Yeah,
Like
that's a good point.
libertarianism per se just says I can't be upset if you use your property to make a profit. Like I can't say whether or not that's good or bad. This is why
It's
yeah,
called a
it's
thin
called
ideology, right?
thin ideology is that it doesn't cover the question of whether or not you should make a property that way. Like let's take an example that I think both you and I agree on, which is prostitution. Now libertarianism per se would say, well, no one's being aggressed, so they should be allowed to sell sex for money. And I would say absolutely. But you know what? As a Christian, I also think that's a pretty terrible way to make money. And I actually think it's incredibly immoral. And I really, uh, well, if if the town I lived in was famous for prostitution, I would probably either want to move or I would do whatever I could to end that. Short of aggression, I wouldn't use aggression to end it. I wouldn't use the violence of the state or violence of any kind. But I would do my best to convince people that there's a better way to live, that there's a better way to make money. I would try and convince these women to get out of the trade, things like that. Like, I think that's immoral. I think it's a terrible way to live. I think it's awful. And I would do whatever I could to end it. That doesn't make me not libertarian. That makes me not just a libertarian.
Yeah. And that's actually the really beautiful thing about the ideology is you also believe that that's the best way to end terrible
Yeah,
things like that, right? Is to bring it out in the open, and you're able to address the problem better, and you're able to address the problem without infringing on other people's
right.
rights, even if that's a right to do a
Yeah,
terrible thing.
absolutely. And yeah,
Similarly, we also believe that the the right to your own property actually distributes resources in a more
right.
equitable way. It's not just about
Yeah,
being selfish. It and to many of us, it's not about being selfish
yeah,
at all. We actually believe that the most prosperity comes through the private, voluntary allocation
absolutely.
of resources.
And that's where that's where I think that a lot of libertarians get confused or people who call themselves libertarians, and I know it's like very uncool to have purity tests nowadays, but I think that's as a baseline purity test. Whether or not you are a private or a property rights absolutist and a non-aggressionist in that sense, that is libertarianism. If you're not that, you're not a libertarian. And you can call yourself any number of things. Like you can call yourself an anarchist or an anti-statist and even an anarcho-capitalist if you want to, but that's not libertarian. And that's why I emphasize that even though we are both anarcho-capitalists, we emphasize that we are the flyover libertarian is because we happen to think that part of it is probably more important. If I had to say, obviously I'm against the state because it is this massive institution of aggression and because it lays claim on private property that it has no right to lay claim to. But I want to front load that private property and self ownership and non aggression part of it because honestly, I'll take a consistent minarchist over an inconsistent anarchist anyway. I think like Murray Rothbard in his book, or not his book, his essay, "Do You Hate the State?" says he'll take a radical minarchist over a I don't know his words, but like a squishy anarchist. And I would say I would say I would take a libertarian minarchist over a non-libertarian anarchist, because I know that the former is probably going to be my ally a lot longer than the latter.
Yeah. Yeah, there's some screwy anarchists that don't emphasize or don't believe in
Yeah, I
property
mean,
rights at all.
leftist anarchist
And
one.
in order to maintain that, you need
Yeah,
authoritarianism. So you need authoritarianism to
yeah.
maintain
But
that.
I mean,
So
I would also say like
um,
there's also the fact is once you get out of the strict Republican versus Democrat paradigm, uh, you'll find yourself making alliances all over the place with people who are not exactly what you are. I'll I know a lot of right-ish anarchists on Twitter that I like talking to, though that they wouldn't call themselves libertarians, and it's not just because they're confused about whether or not you can be both libertarian and anarchist. They actually know what libertarianism is, and they are not that. And I also know what's that?
interesting. That's
Yeah,
interesting. I
I saw
so
someone. This is also where we were talking about anti-war in our last episode, I think 2 episodes ago.
yeah.
And we also find ourselves allying with certain leftists on that regard. More like what do you call the old peacenik leftists? That we would find
Yeah.
alliances there that sometimes will leave some of our rightist friends who are with us on things like culture war and free speech and things like that. We'll leave them behind when it comes to
Yeah.
war.
I just heard this week that Bernie said he wouldn't Bernie said he would veto the Patriot Act. I'm like, "Don't make me
Oh,
like
did
you."
he really?
Yeah, he said he would
Huh.
veto it. And yeah, there's
Interesting.
enough Democrats in Congress against it and enough Republicans in Congress against it. It actually is is likely that they would not be able to override it. So that's just an interesting, thing that could play out. But so contrasting the, you know, agreements you can make with, or the common ground that you can find with leftists, you also have um, a lot of similar values with conservatives.
Mhm.
And so, um, I came up with this phrase a while ago that's anarcho-capitalism is just consistent libertarianism, and libertarianism is just consistent conservatism. So, what do you
Mhm.
see the connection there? How do you make the leap from conservative to libertarian to anarcho-capitalist? What's the common thread there?
Well, this is where conservative philosophy I am probably not as well versed at as I could. be. So I know I'm going to maybe if any true philosophical conservatives are listening, they might yeah if that and if any of them are listening you know but like there's sort of a conservatism. This is Kirk Russell Kirk would say that conservatism isn't an ideology, and and I guess to an extent I get what he means by that. Which is sort of its um that's its strength and its weakness because it's not an ideology. It's hard to pin down. It's more of a sensibility. And so there tends to be something very in old right conservatism. There's a sort of realism. There's not this like a messianic sort of view. Um the Great Wars, so called. Those were progressive wars because they were about remaking the world in America's image. And that's what this whole Middle Eastern thing has been about, that. But conservatism is much more like realistic as opposed to messianic. There's an understanding of human nature that mere education isn't going to fix it, that there is something selfish in nature, and this for me harmonizes very easily with my views of humans from a Christian perspective, that we are all sinful by nature, we're fallen by nature, and there's something uh, broken inside of us that just educating, or if I just free the populace of Iraq, they're going to do good things. No, they're not. They're still sinful, broken human beings. And so the conservative impulse would say, let's do less fixing the world and more focusing on being a good neighbor, focus on my community. And so there's a very strong decentralization focus to true conservatism, that let's not be the United States of America, let's be Iowa, let's be Southeast Iowa, Northwest Iowa, let's be wherever we are, and let's be that as much as we can. Let's focus on building up our neighborhood. And there's a lot there that I think libertarianism would say, yeah, absolutely, or specifically anarcho-capitalism, especially to show our cards of the more Hoppian variety, where we see how a stateless society would probably have to be centered very small on private, um well, Hoppe called them covenant communities. And this is very conservative, this idea. And so we would say the reason why I would say that sort of conservative impulse of decentralization is it would be consistently fulfilled in libertarianism, would be to say, well, yeah, and there shouldn't be a state over top of it that is lusting for power. What happened in the old city states is of Greeks, the Greek city states is, they would start lusting after the territory of their neighbors, and they inevitably want to become an empire and start controlling more and more area until one empire gains dominion over another, and they become a vassal state. And this is what happens with states. They always lust for more and more power. Whereas a stateless covenant community, one that's based on voluntary covenanting between, honestly, I would probably between families. I think most covenant communities would be family based. Um, would be there's no lust for power there. There's a focus on your house, focus on your family, and focus on being a good neighbor. That would be there.
Conservative values that they at least espouse are, conservatives are saying the government should hold these values and uphold these values. And libertarians say the government can't
Yeah.
uphold these values, so we need to do it this way. And
Yeah.
maybe a minarchist would say, well, the government can't, but we have to have the government do X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
But an anarcho-capitalist says the government can't, the government shouldn't, the state, excuse me, a government will, but a state, right. A state can't. The incentives aren't there for it to.
Yeah.
the state isn't have the incentives aligned to uphold property rights
Yeah.
for every human being
Yeah.
without that being corrupted. Um, and that's why I say it's just a line of more getting more consistent because
Mm-hmm.
a conservative already has a classical conservative already
Yeah.
has basically the principles that we're looking for, the ones that we agree with, but our execution differs wildly by the time you get to anarcho-capitalism.
Yeah, and I think that this is where I think sometimes people get weary of labels, but they're not extreme J types like I am. So I actually love labels because it helps me to understand who is on my team at what point and to sort of see who am I going to have the most in common with. And this is where I think uh, right libertarianism, which is libertarianism from the right, is a helpful label. And even better, something like a conservative libertarian or a libertarian conservative or whichever order you want to put things in is helpful, is because I know when I'm talking to them, they're going to agree with me on the fact that property rights and personal and and non-aggression is the right of every individual. I know they're going to agree with me on the evil of the state, whether or not they are a full anarchist libertarian or a minarchist libertarian, and they agree with me that degenerate lifestyle does not tend toward the abolition of the state and the promotion of private property rights. Like moral degeneracy ultimately creates a high time preference society, a society that wants everything now. That doesn't wait, doesn't, uh, yeah, and also is a low trust society. They don't trust their neighbor, like the rugged individualist, the one who does not, puts a fence up and doesn't want to talk to their neighbor. Like that type of society is not going to flourish as an
Oh, that's
anarcho-capitalist
interesting.
society.
That's an interesting specific viewpoint from the right
Yeah.
libertarianism. I never thought about that.
What is?
Um, like being against moral degeneracy
Right.
because it actually um
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, just what you're saying.
And I mean, to put my cards on the table, I would be against it even if it wasn't aiding me
Well,
in
yeah,
going
but
toward.
it's interesting that you find a connection between your
Yeah.
thin ideology and your thick ideology.
Yeah. Well, it's true, and I think that's where, um, yeah, something that I've honestly been batting this term around in my head. I call a thick thinnest. There's some people who are so thin libertarian that they're like, you can't be more than this. This is what you are. You're a libertarian. And like, I made a joke on Twitter the other day about how some libertarians are like that really needy girl in high school who was like, wait, you're friends with me, you can't be friends with them too. Like that. You can't be something other than a libertarian. I saw you hanging out with a conservative. How could you hang out with that conservative? Hey, wait a minute, why are you talking to Tulsi fans? You can't talk to Tulsi fans, you're a libertarian. Well, I can have other friends because I have other things. There are other things that matter, and either they matter because they matter, like whether they're libertarian or not, or they matter because though they don't have anything to do with libertarianism per se, they do have an effect on that. I think that a low time preference, high trust society is necessary for an anarcho-capitalist society. Otherwise, they're going to find another king and put them on the throne. They're just going to establish another state. It's just inevitable.
Sure. Can you define high time preference, low time preference real quick for
Yeah.
people that don't read economics for fun?
Well, yeah. Time preference, honestly, to be honest, I don't, mediocre economist at best. But this is one of
Yeah,
those.
you don't need to know the technical,
Yeah.
but you can explain how you're using it.
But time preference would be like whether or not. I mean, like, okay, so the difference between one kid who gets a quarter and spends it on a gumball and the other kid who puts it in their piggy bank. The first one is a high time preference. They want to spend that money and get something now. I want that gumball. I'm spending that gumball now. Low time preference is saying, you know what? I could spend this on a gumball, or I could put this in my piggy bank and get something better later. So now there's functionally there are some things that we are going to be high time preference about. I need to eat in order to live, so I need to be a little high time preference about my next meal. But this is also why poverty, especially institutional poverty, tends to create high time preferences, is because they can only think about their next meal. They can only think about, oh, I have money now, what am I going to spend it on? Whereas to become wealthier, you need to be able to think, well, I'm going to spend as little as possible and think long term. But if you are institutionally high time preference, you can't think long term. You know, it's a right now, right now, right now mentality, and a lot of degenerate mentality is like that. You know, why would I want to have sex with the same person forever? So I'm never going to get married. Well, because you don't have a low time preference to think about all that comes with the value of a covenanted, committed, lifetime, lifelong partnership. There's a lot more to it than just I want my variety, and so I'm gonna do what I want. You know?
Sure. So there's the connection to you, like the rest of your worldview is like,
Yeah,
not only do you believe like that's like morally right, but you also believe that
yeah,
it leads to
and
like
yeah,
a better functioning
and
society.
and I see this in my church too, right? Like, and not necessarily in my church, but in the church in general. I see it like I'm trying to convince, especially I I'm a youth pastor, and I'm trying to convince these like teenagers are naturally high time preference, and trying to convince them to
They
think
just haven't been around as
long
long,
term.
so
Right? Yeah, they don't have a long term to base on, but to try and get them to think long term, especially eternal long term, to think, these things are fun. These things that you're doing, or just sort of wasting your time on your phone, or wasting, this is good, fun and good short term, but long term, you are going to see much greater joy out of consistently getting in the habit of doing things like reading good books, reading the Bible, prayer, things like that. And that's the same thing with talking to um, people who are institutionally high time preference, either due to generational poverty or due to the fact that we live in a society that is institutionally high time preference, is trying to get them to think, well, yeah, you don't have a lot of money and the billionaire has lots of money, but think about it. If you tax the billionaire, you're taking away your iPhone. Like, that's created by a billionaire who is trying to make more billions. And if you would instead start adapting your lifestyle to think more long term, the gap between you and this billionaire is not going to be zero. Like, you're probably not going to make $1 billion, but it's going to be smaller than it is if you can just adjust your time preference.
yeah.
And of course, social trust is the other side of that I was talking about. That, social trust is whether or not you believe your neighbor is looking out for you, or whether or not you are looking out for your neighbor. And obviously, societies with low social trust, where are they going to look for help? The government.
Yeah. So a conservative would also value social trust,
Yeah.
but the difference maybe would be
Whether or not they
they
think a state can institute high time.
yeah, they
Yeah.
might think that a state could actually foster that
Yeah. But I think
or
it's a little
build
bit
it.
like playing with fire, you know?
Yeah. It's just like outsourcing, just like we outsource our um just like we outsource our call to care for the widows and orphans.
Yeah.
It's like we outsource our social trust
Yeah.
in the same way. And
Yeah.
it's like you don't build it at all that way.
Right. Yeah. It's true. Because, I mean, ultimately, this is the biggest thing, is freedom or liberty necessarily entails responsibility. Like it's, you know, when you're a kid and you want your parents to leave you alone, what you really want is to be able to do whatever you want. The thing is, you get into the real world and you find out there's a whole host of other reasons why you can't just do whatever you want. Because my money is not just going toward my fun stuff, it's also going toward feeding myself and clothing myself and keeping my car running and my house. Like there's responsibilities that come with being free of my parents. Where sometimes, I know that many adults like me have sometimes thought about like, man, I wanted to become an adult so quickly, but I should have enjoyed being a kid sometimes because I could just blow my money on stupid things because food was going to be on my table because my parents are going to put it there. And really that's an amazing analogy for, like there's some so-called libertarians who want to live a degenerate lifestyle and think that that's the way to promote libertarianism is by, tapping into this stoner mentality and things like that. But truly, those people don't want liberty. They want to be able to do whatever they want. They don't want liberty because liberty means responsibility. They want someone taking care of them so they can blow their money on fun stuff.
Oh, I understand left libertarians so much better now.
Right. Yeah, and that's
not even kidding.
It's true, but it's true that that's what liberty entails. And I know a lot of libertarians or many libertarians like to say people are libertarian. They just don't know it yet. But I don't think they are.
No, some of them aren't.
I think they look like libertarians because they want to do whatever they want, but they only want to do that because someone's footing the bill for the important stuff. Someone else is going to pay for my housing, my food, my education, all these things that I need and that I would have to take responsibility for if someone else wasn't footing the bill for that. But the problem is they're not seeing that comes with a boot on their neck. And so that's why I think those two are so vitally connected. My conservative viewpoint and my libertarian anarchistic viewpoint is because people, if they want liberty, they're also going to have to learn responsibility. They're going to have to learn how to forego short-term pleasures for long-term goods, or what we in kind of the church can sometimes call the difference between mere happiness and joy. Joy is long-term. Joy is harder, but joy is far more worthwhile than mere momentary happiness. And in fact, momentary happiness, if pursued in a poor way, can severely jeopardize long-term joy.
Well, this has been another episode of The Flyover Libertarian. Be sure to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, and Google Play, and join our email list at www.flyover.page. Thanks.
Hey, what's up? Oh my goodness, what's my intro? Oh boy. I hope this isn't like portending something terrible.